Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for tuning into Koshur Musalman. So, in the previous podcast, we talked about Fanon and his understanding of settler colonialism and decolonization. Today, we will be talking about the cultural and the psychological aspect of colonialism. We would be taking into reading the ideas of Fanon and his contemporary, another Algerian thinker whose name is Malik bin Nabi. We will also go through the ideas of Hussein Bolhan, who wrote a very important book called Frantz, Fanon and the Psychology of Oppression. And we would also go through the ideas of Ngũgĩ Thiong'o, who is a Kenyan writer, and he also suffered jail time for his opposition to cultural imperialism. So when we study Fanon's works, we get this idea that for Fanon, you see, colonialism, it's not just a geopolitical or a socio-economic phenomenon. Its roots are psychological and existential. That's why Malik bin Nabi, Fanon's contemporary, you see, colonialism, it's a state of mind. The process of colonization begins in the mind of the colonizer. So for decolonization to successfully happen, it has to begin in the minds of the colonized. That's why Hussein Bolhan says that there is no system of oppression that lasts without occupation of the minds of the oppressed. Yotatam Koshur Musalman zehni tor azad. Yotatam ye zehni tor महसूस करा आज़ादी हिंस ज़रूरत. Totatam there is every chance of the demise of colonialism. But the moment this Kashmiri Muslim becomes mentally colonized, he accepts colonization in his mind, he justifies it in his mind, then India would not need physical violence even to maintain its occupation of Kashmir. That's why Ngũgĩ Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer, he says that while bullet is a mode of physical subjugation in the colonized societies, language, which is a very important tool of cultural imperialism, it is a mode of spiritual and mental subjugation. And while the physical violence is visibly brutal, it is the latter which is gentle and subtle, and it grants permanence to occupation. So what does Fanon tell us of culture under colonial domination? It's an interesting and important question considering the fact that Kashmir mein kya log tim kaf kara about preservation of culture, but they won't talk about the cause of liberation. And it's ironic because Fanon tells us that culture of people living under colonial domination is a culture whose destruction is sought systematically and constantly by the colonizer. We are a society of Kashmiri Muslims. We have our own history, our own culture, our own ethics and values. Now the Indian state aims at replacing our culture with that of a Hindu majoritarian culture, because it very well knows that our kids and our next generation is not going to magically start identifying as Indians just because they have an identity card or a passport that says so. They will only identify as Indians after being subjected to a process called Indianization of Kashmiri culture. So Fanon tells us that to fight for the preservation of your culture, first of all, means fighting for your liberation. And one cannot separate the combat, the struggle for culture, from people's struggle for liberation. Because what makes a culture? What is a culture made of? It is made of people. And if resisting colonialism, if resisting tyranny is a part of who we are, it's a very essential part of our history. It's going to be a very important part of our history. It's a part of our culture. So Fanon tells us that liberation is a precondition for culture. It is liberation that will provide the culture with the conditions necessary for its true expression and for its growth. To put it in simple words, only when we are free, only in a free Kashmir will our culture be truly free. And then Fanon tells us that imperialism, especially cultural imperialism, it leaves behind germs of rot which we must clinically detect and remove, not just from our land but our minds as well. यह छुन मुमकिन कह कि अकिस कौमस पेठी गुलामी मुसल्लत करना तो तथ आसन असरात जहनी असरात कह अस निश एग्जाम्पल ऑफ कीनिया येल कीनियस आज़ादी मीज फ्रॉम ब्रिटिश कॉलोनाइजेशन तिमो कर लोकल ट्रेडिशंस बैन लोकल कस्टम्स करिक बैन लोकल लैंग्वेजेस तो करिक बैन English language banavik compulsory, and it's not surprising because germs of colonialism were still in their minds. Fanon's contemporary Malik bin Nabi shwana कि one does not cease to be colonized until one ceases to be colonizable. What does it mean to be colonizable, or what does it mean to have colonizability? To be colonizable is when you think that your life as a society or as an individual should be determined by the values and thoughts of other people. When you love and admire the culture of other people so much that it translates into you hating your own civilization, into you hating your own culture, into you hating your own religion, that is when you are, as an individual or as a society, you are colonizable even if you are not colonized yet. From Malik bin Nabi's theory of colonizability, we get two things we can understand. One is that once the colonizer establishes control over the land and the resources, then it turns to the minds of the natives. Fanon tells us that colonialism is not satisfied merely with holding a people or land in its grip. It empties the native brain, tries to empty the native brain of all form and meaning, and it doesn't stop there. It turns to the past of the oppressed people, like the Indian state turns to the past of Kashmiri people, and distorts it, disfigures it, and destroys it. After Kashmir was colonized by India, there were people who started developing traits of colonizability, or maybe they already had them. They started giving economic justifications to Indian colonization of Kashmir. Some said that maybe Kashmir would benefit by India's secular credentials, and as Fanon tells us that the oppressed believe the worst about themselves. Some thought that maybe we are not good enough to govern ourselves. Maybe if the Indian state leaves Kashmir, there would be anarchy in Kashmir. And while self-reflection and discussion on our shortcomings as a society is indispensable, issue aham कि इस करो ये discussion के इसमें क्या खामिश, but it is a conversation that has to happen amongst us, between you and me. It cannot originate from the colonizer. It is not a conversation that can happen between the colonizer, who is the antithesis of morality, and the colonized. The second thing that we get from Malik bin Nabi's theory of colonizability is that your mind can be colonized long before your land is colonized. And this is best articulated in Ngũgĩ Thiong'o, his book Decolonizing the Mind. He says, and it's a single line, he says, what is the difference between a politician who says Africa cannot do without colonialism, without imperialism? Now this is physical colonization. And the writer who says Africa cannot do without European languages. Now there might not be European colonization of Africa, physical colonization. But if you think that Africa cannot do without European languages, without European culture, then your mind is colonized, even though your land is not. But when your mind is colonized, your land stays colonizable. Now, these germs of cultural and mental colonialism, once they penetrate into the psyche and the social relations of the colonized individual, then these germs control and occupy the whole existence of the colonized individual, both in his psychological and social existence. This colonized individual then thinks about everything how the colonizer wants him to. You see, mentally colonized individual chu Kashir maz. You should pannis panis mutlik, pannis religionist mutlik, pannis culturist mutlik, pannis zabani mutlik, pannis naturist mutlik, har kun cheezas mutlik, ती सोचा ये Indian state yatsanch. And then this colonized individual pretty much ceases to be himself. He becomes a creation of the colonizer. And then this individual at times would identify as an Indian Kashmiri. And there is no phrase that is more humiliating and degrading than this phrase. I'm an Indian Kashmiri. And it's a self-contradictory phrase. And then this individual at times would tell his people the benefits of slavery. Ishpat wana lukan golami hind faid. Therefore, when we talk of decolonization, it has to begin with our mind. We need to believe that we do not deserve to be colonized. Our mind should sense the abnormality and the evil nature of colonialism, and no material or economic benefit should change how we view this disease called colonialism. So Ngũgĩ Thiong'o wrote a very important book on decolonization. It's called Decolonizing the Mind. And he said that the physical violence of the battlefield in a colonized society is zulum tajabar shugasa. This physical violence will always be followed by the psychological violence of the classroom. And it's the psychological violence of the classroom that strengthens occupation and grants permanence to it. As settler colonialism becomes a reality, Sani Khatra, we have to keep in mind that you see Indian state show yikar istemal language, the literature, betalim, to take our kids further and further away from themselves and their own culture to the culture of the colonizer. In the name of education, what we would see is the Indianization of our kids, and in the impressionable mind of a colonized kid, sure to sure, emisi hitchnao yehesti. The religion of this kid, the culture, the language, and the history of his own people shall be associated with inferiority, barbarism, extremism, and backwardness. And then this child would be made to stand outside his body. This is a metaphor. He would be made to stand outside himself, to look at himself, and he will then feel what is called colonial alienation towards his own people and his own environment. So you realize that there can be no preservation of the culture or educational prosperity or any form of good living under colonialism. You cannot take delight in sending your child to school because the school is also a tool of the colonizer, like everything else also is. Ngũgĩ Thiong'o also talks about resistance to colonialism, and he says that in the context of British colonization of Kenya, but it's relevant to us, there are 5 levels of survival, 5 forms of survival that are necessary for the success of any anti-colonial resistance movement. And when he talks about survival, he means survival of the collective society of the colonized people and not survival of the individuals. Now, it's necessary for us to start thinking of ourselves as parts of a single unit, faced with the common disease of colonialism and united by a common culture, a common history, and a common future. Now, the first form of survival is physical. It involves physical resistance to physical subjugation, like last time we talked about how, in the eyes of Fanon, anti-colonial violence is a very fruitful method of decolonization. So for us to resist colonialism, the first thing we need to do is exist. But in a place like Kashmir, where the colonizer has a genocidal impulse, there is an interplay of resistance and existence. In a place where the colonizer constantly seeks to eradicate you, Indian state ke Kashir mas gasna Koshur namo nishan rozun kya. You can only exist by resisting what threatens your physical existence. The second form of survival is economic survival. It's pretty much an extension of physical survival because you cannot physically exist without some form of economic sustenance and livelihood. That's why settler colonialism attacks the livelihood of people. Yim چھِ کران لُکن ہُنٛد یُس روزگار چھُ تَتھ پٮ۪ٹھ attack because when you threaten their livelihood, it is simply threatening their very existence, and that is why we as people, as Kashmiri Muslims, more than ever we need to look after each other. The third form of survival is cultural survival. While physical resistance helps you exist physically, cultural resistance means to not just protect your life, but protect who you are. It means to protect your culture, your religion, and your history, and all your values. Cultural resistance or cultural survival is to simply not assimilate into the colonizing culture. Now, the fourth form of survival is psychological survival, and we talked about this before. It is to have a decolonized mind. It is to be free in your head. It is to get rid of mental shackles of colonialism. It is to have a mind that understands how colonialism is abnormal and inimical to human nature. The final form of survival is political survival. It is the survival of your political objectives and motives. Before 1950s, 1960s, there was a unanimous call in Palestine for reversal of settler colonialism. And there was a call for dismantling of all the settlements in West Bank and other places. But as time passed, as settler colonialism became a reality, the political motives of the Palestinians changed as well. Now there is a call for democracy and equal rights between the indigenous original inhabitants and the settlers. So we have to work for political survival, otherwise we might land into a similar situation. So when these 5 forms of survival, physical, economic, cultural, psychological, and political, when they are integrated as a whole, then according to Ngũgĩ or Thiong'o, the resistance against colonialism might succeed. Now the last thing in our today's podcast I talk about is Hussein Bulhan. Hussein Bulhan wrote a book. It was called Fanon and the Psychology of Oppression. He talks about how it is necessary to emphasize the choice of resistance that the colonized people make, because otherwise the colonial psychology reduces us to passive victims. If you think about it, when the Indian liberals express some sense of compassion with the Kashmiri people over the human rights violations that happen here, that compassion is self-serving, and it turns us into objects of oppression who deserve sympathy and charity, and it freezes us in a permanent state of victimhood. And therefore, it is necessary for us to realize that we must be self-determining actors. Yes, there is oppression, but we make a choice as to how we face this oppression. As Albert Camus talks about this, he says that even a person forced to the gallows, let's say there's a Kashmiri prisoner of conscience, and now he's being taken to gallows. Now he knows that going to gallows is a reality for him, but he chooses how he or she faces death. This person can weep, this person can scream, shake, or surrender, or maybe die with dignity and honor. So this is a choice that this person makes, and it's necessary for us to emphasize this choice again and again, and not to internalize oppression, not to make victimhood our identity. Thank you so much for listening to us, and this is all for today's podcast. I hope you liked it. Please let us know your comments and feedback on our Twitter page. Allah Hafiz.